snowball. Hold up. Hold up, do I sound alright? Let me check. This is me talking. I don't know. Do I sound alright? It's hard to tell. My mic wasn't plugged in right when I started, and now it just says that I'm using the Micro 5 Alright, we're having a little chaos here at the beginning. But, whatevs. I think we're good. I hope no one tells me otherwise, although that mic did sound a little bit quiet for my liking. Blah, 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 blah. Okay, maybe it'll be better as we get along with the stream, but I don't know. Yeah, that's definitely way too low. You guys might have to turn me up a little or something, I don't know. But regardless, here we are. Now you might be saying, "No, Radix, behind you, that doesn't really look like the Middle East now, does it? Weren't we planning on starting the Middle East course today?" And I'm like, I still need to do more time for research. I haven't had time to do any research. I literally put this one together like over the course of a few minutes before this stream. But yeah, good thing it's something I actually know. But like with the Middle East, I'm going to need more time for research. So for the time being, I'm stalling with what should be a quickie in the form of the Satsuma Rebellion. Yes. So that's my story, and I'm sticking to it. This is going to be sort of a in-spirit sequel, or a squeakquel, if you will, to my Boshin War lesson thing. And I just ate a pizza, so I'm feeling a bit sluggish. So hopefully you can forgive me with that. So let's just see what we can do here. Satsuma Rebellion. Let me move Twitch chat over. No, I can't do that. Joe. So we're going to be following up on the stuff that happened after the Boshin War. It's going to sort of bridge the gap from Japan after the Boshin War until about, when the Constitution is written, stuff like that. We'll get to see the origins of Japan's gun laws and stuff like that. The origin of the yen being printed on a bill. Fun stuff. So, man, it's been a while since I've done this, because last week I was too busy. I almost was too busy this week. But let's just jump right into this. So, the Boshin War. Let me check my things. The Boshin War, a little civil war we've already talked about. Got the Emperor on power. Here we have Emperor Meiji. So he was in power. I feel so discombobulated. Japan was originally under the control of the shogun. Then Japan had to open up to westernization. A lot of people didn't like that, especially people in Satsuma, which you can see on the map there, and Choshu, which you can also see on the map there. And as we talked about last time, my family actually comes from the Satsuma region. But the Satsuma and Choshu didn't like the westernization, and they sort of got the alliance with the Emperor Meiji, and then they fought a civil war against the shogun and established the Empire of Japan after crushing the shogunate forces. So, again, we have Emperor Meiji, but one of the most important leaders during the Boshin War was a Satsuma official by the name of Saigo Takamori, and that's Saigo Takamori there. Saigo Takamori was part of the Sonojoi movement. He was very fiercely anti-westernization, very pro-emperor. In fact, he led most of those campaigns that go north, at least from about Toba to Edo. He was the one who personally oversaw the surrender of the shogun. He wiped out much of the shogun forces. Mr. Saigo Takamori was a national hero. He also came from the samurai class. He and his forces were all samurai. Japan at the time was divided basically into four different, what they called the four occupations, I believe it was called. You could be a samurai, a farmer, an artisan, or a merchant. Now, of course, that caste system doesn't include nobles and like general slaves, although slavery was something that was sort of dying out in Japan by now, if not completely died out. But yeah, let's see. But yeah, he was part of the samurai class. The samurai class, they had, a little bit of privilege in the sense that they had, spots reserved for them in the military, and that they could carry. They walked around with their swords. Just walking through town, they were allowed to have swords on their belts, and they were allowed to carry their swords in public. No one else was allowed to carry weapons in public, although you were allowed to have weapons, personally, just not, I guess, sort of a concealed carry. Not even a concealed carry, because a concealed carry means you can take it into public as long as no one can see it. You couldn't take it into public, but you were allowed to have weapons. The samurai, on the other hand, were allowed to bring their weapons out into public, and they did not need to conceal them. They typically wore their swords for the most part with pride. Their laws also applied to like muskets, but there weren't many muskets in Japan. Those were a fairly new phenomena that was brought in with westernization. So, let's see. There's also Ito Hirobumi. Ito Hirobumi was from Choshu. So Ito Hirobumi, there we go, and Saigo Takamori were like best bros, What am I moving? Why did that happen? Hold up. Saigo, let's move you over here. And then Hirobumi, we can move you over here. So Saigo was pretty much the symbol of Satsuma. Ito Hirobumi was pretty much the symbol of Choshu. These guys were part of the Genro. The Genro is sort of the Japanese term for founding father. In America, we call our founding fathers, the people who signed the Declaration of Independence. In Japan, the imperial forces, the main politicians and military commanders in the Boshin War, are called the Genro, which is essentially the founding fathers. Let's see. So, Ito Hirobumi will eventually become the first prime minister of Japan, but let's not get ahead of ourselves. Because right now the emperor is large and in charge. Let me bring the emperor back up. He has just taken over the country. He has full power, and he's pretty much using it as an absolute monarch. Although this is kind of viewed as problematic for Saigo and Ito, who both view that the emperor should be a spiritual leader. Even though their motto was revere the emperor, and they fought for the emperor to restore him to political power in the Boshin War, they sort of had this view that the emperor was really meant to serve as a spiritual authority, and that Emperor Meiji was to pretty much make Saigo and Ito be the forerunners, be the ministers of Japan. They would handle the actual political stuff. Political power shifts from shogunate to this was called this sort of power structure, by the way, with the Meiji emperor having all the power, with all his sub ministers like Ito Hirobumi and Saigo Takamori. This was called the Meiji oligarchy, because it was effectively an oligarchy. There wasn't really any democracy. It was just, these guys won the war, so we're just going to let them set up the country for a little bit, Another officer from Choshu, just like Ito Hirobumi, and a veteran of the Boshin War, where is he? Was Yamagata Aritomo. Yamagata Aritomo here. Yamagata is going to be a pretty important dude later in the story, but he's just sort of a officer that's, rising through the ranks of the Imperial Japanese Army at the time because of his service for the Choshu domain during the Boshin War. So he was part of the Meiji oligarchy as well. So political power shifts. Satsuma and Choshu officials believe in traditional idea. Genro Meiji oligarchy. They sort of believed that they were since they, created the Empire of Japan, they felt it was their right to sort of continue to establish it and serve as Japan's founders. Now, one of the goals of the Genro, the Meiji oligarchy, although this doesn't really apply to Saigo as much, but the Meiji oligarchy minus Saigo really liked the idea of abolishing the policy of the 4 occupations, that farmer, samurai, merchant, and artisan caste system I mentioned earlier. They saw that, for the most part, most of Europe was no longer feudal. They still had some class divisions, but they weren't really feudal societies. By the late 1800s, they're really shifting into capitalism, which some people refer to as neo-feudalism, not noodle feudalism. That I don't think that's what it's called. But so they want to the Genro, the Meiji oligarchy. They want to abolish the 4 caste system, the 4 occupation system. They want to create a socially equal Japanese state. They think that if they make Japan's society more equal and more Western, then Japan's gonna prosper for it. While they're preparing for getting rid of the social classes, they do stuff like they improve their harbors, their lighthouse, they begin importing machinery, they start building schools, they build up overseas study areas for students. They actually allow students to go overseas to study. They bring in foreign teachers and advisors from outside Japan and give them salaries. They modernize the army and navy, though we kind of saw that with the Boshin War. Railroads are lined throughout Japan, and telegraph networks are made, really bring Japan to the modern era. There's also foreign diplomatic missions like the Iwakura mission. So let's get rid of these guys. We can get rid of the Boshin War. Now, the Iwakura mission was a couple of Japanese diplomats who went out to explore the world, to undo the unequal treaties. If you remember from the Boshin War episode, I mentioned that once Japan was opened up to the Western world, they were put through what were called the unequal treaties. Because the Western powers, the United States, Europe, because they were negotiating from a position of power, the unequal treaties took place, which meant Japan pretty much had a big trade deficit with the foreign powers. It wasn't fair. So the Iwakura mission goes out to the world to try to renegotiate the unequal treaties. They go to the United States, they go to the United Kingdom. Really, those two are their focus, America and Britain. Those two are the focus of the mission after the Boshin War. They get sent out in 1871, 2 years after the Boshin War ends. They try to renegotiate the unequal treaties, but they don't really succeed. For the most part, America and Britain are like, you think we were going to renegotiate these treaties? What are you going to do, fight us? And then, the Iwakura mission is just a failure. Though they do get to see more of the world, and they come to the understanding that Japan, even with all the westernization that's going on, Japan is terribly backwards compared to the rest of the world when it comes to industrialization. One of the ways that Japan was sort of backwards was with the social class system that was set up. Let's see. Now, they also went to France and Germany, though that wasn't really too much of a focus. I have this picture here. If you look closely, you'll see that there are samurai standing in Egypt. Those are samurai in front of the Sphinx with the pyramid in the background. Now, this was part of Japan's, policy of exploring the world, coming to understand more of the world around them. Now, this actually isn't part of the Iwakura mission. This was a mission in 1863 that Japan sent out. In fact, I think this might be a shogunate mission, come to think of it. But, I just think it's an interesting photo, just to see all these samurai standing in front of the Sphinx. So, let's see. Other reforms? Okay. Oh, well. So let's go into getting rid of the social classes here. It was mostly through tax and economic policy that they got rid of the social classes and made everyone equal. Of course, they abolished all the systems as well. Now, with the four systems, farmer, artisan, merchant, and samurai, really farmers, artisans, and merchants were all peasants. Samurai were the only ones with, illustrious privileges. Now, when you abolish this caste system, the samurai are the ones getting gypped here, so the samurai aren't really happy about it. Now, we mentioned the daimyo earlier, the people who ruled their domains. The domains were abolished, and they were reorganized into prefectures. The daimyo, they lost their titles as daimyo, sort of their political power, but they did get the class of nobility. Even though the social system in Japan was being wiped out, a new social system was being built up with nobles and peasants. Basically, Japan saw that, hey, that's how it is in England, that's how it is in France. Well, not so much in France since the revolution, but pretty much that's how it is in England, that's how it is in Germany. So the system got simplified into a system of nobles, former daimyo, and then the peasants, everyone else. So does that make the samurai peasants? Kinda. The samurai lose their exclusive claims to their military positions. They're no longer soldiers. Now, to put this into perspective, Europe, at any time during the feudal age, Europe had about less than 1% of their population being knights. Knights, of course, being the European equivalent of Japanese samurai. I think in England, during, around the time of the War of the Roses, there were about just 5,000 knights compared to, I think, a population of 3 million. France only had less than 1... Overall, the nations have about less than 1%, sometimes 0.18% knights in their entire national population. The knights aren't really a big population in medieval Europe. In feudal Japan, which was 10 years ago, in the context of this story, samurai made up around 10% of Japanese society. At its weakest, it was typically around 5%, but around this time period, samurai are 10%, and that's even after the Boshin War, where the samurai were kind of wiped out by the Gatling gun. So the remaining samurai were largely loyalists to the emperor and helped from Satsuma and Choshu. So the Satsuma and Choshu samurai and other samurai made up 10% of the Japanese population. That's 10% of trained warriors who have weapons that all of a sudden are having their rights taken away and are all of a sudden out of a job. So there's some instability going on here. One of the ways that the Japanese government tried to pay sort of reparations, recompensation for taking away the noble status of samurai and pretty much getting rid of their jobs was by paying them a stipend, which meant that they got money from the government over time. But as time went on, there was a little bit of corruption in the Japanese government. Japan really needed money, by the way, at this time. After fighting the Boshin War and undergoing this very expensive westernization process, money was a big issue. So they were trying to get as much money as possible. Eventually, the money they were paying the samurai off started to become less paid to the samurai and more, we're going to take the money we're giving you in the name of taxation. And soon the samurai aren't getting paid anymore. So that's a little bit of a problem for the samurai, as you can expect. So the samurai who lose their nobility status, they lose their jobs, and they lose their money from the government. So they try to find other jobs. A lot of samurai I have a list of positions they tried to go for. Let's see, they became bureaucrats, teachers, army officers, police officials, journalists, scholars. They helped colonize northern Japan, which was a largely snowy area. They were bankers and businessmen, but for the most part, they failed at these ventures. From their birth to their adulthood, they were trained to be samurai. They were trained to be fighters. They were trained with Bushido, the way of the warrior, of course, but that doesn't really... Being a traditional warrior isn't a very good mindset when you become a teacher or a banker. So the samurai failed at their jobs, and oftentimes they would be fired. So you had a lot of samurai just straight up unemployed. Now, in the 1500s, Japan was unified And the person who unified Japan was like, alright, I've taken over Japan, but there's the problem with the samurai. Because the samurai are warriors and the only thing they know how to do is fight. And if I don't give them something to do, they're going to start a rebellion. They're going to start chaos in Japan. So I'm going to invade Korea. And not because I think it will be successful, but because I need these samurai guys to do something, or else the country's screwed. They're like, it's like, they're like, oh, some sort of rabid animal weapon that you want to make sure is being set out against your opponents and never just kept idle in your home. So the samurai were sent to Korea and died. So with the Boshin War, Japan's unified. Now what are the samurai going to do? Not only do you have to face the issue of these samurai are very much will likely start a rebellion, but you're also taking away their nobility status. Let's see. Another thing that pissed off the samurai was that Japan gave the right to bear arms to everyone, every male in Japan. Every male in Japan was allowed to bear arms. They were allowed to own swords. They were allowed to own muskets. So the samurai, who used to have like one of their highest levels of pride, was they had pride in the fact that they could walk around carrying a sword and no one else could. All of a sudden, everyone else is walking around with a sword, and they're like, what are these peasants doing with swords? That's supposed to be my exclusive right. But no, they lost that privilege. Everyone gets a gun and a sword now. So they're like, oh man. And you also have to keep in mind that the Satsuma domain and the Choshu domain that supported the emperor the most during the Boshin War were mostly samurai. So you can see that there's a little pickle being formed in here. A lot of these Satsuma and Choshu samurai were actually Sonojoi supporters, and if you remember from last episode, Sonojoi was the revere the emperor, expel the barbarians, hardline type dudes who were against westernization. And they see Japan's westernization. If you remember, Emperor Meiji came to the conference in Hyogo, I believe it was, and convinced the Western powers to recognize Japan during the Boshin War, recognize the imperial government on the condition that Japan continues its westernization and fulfills treaty obligations. So that Meiji's move there betrayed the Sonojoi movement. The samurai are pissed. So that's the setup. That's Japan on the eve of the Satsuma Rebellion. Now, in 1873, we enter what is called the Seikanron. The Seikanron translates to the advocacy of a punitive expedition to Korea. So, just like last time, just like in the 1500s, people have put out the theory that maybe if we don't want the samurai killing everyone, we send them to Korea. So let's set up, Japanese-Korean relations. Here's a map of modern Japan and modern Korea. Back in the day, Korea was one Korea. There was no North Korea and South Korea. But two, Korea was under the thrall, was essentially a territory of the Qing dynasty in China. It wasn't an independent state. Japan didn't fully get that at the time, but if you remember from last episode, the only place Japan had relations with Korea was on the island of Tsushima, where they only allowed to conduct trade. Diplomatic relations between Japan and Korea, besides trade, wasn't so good. Japanese people weren't even allowed to set foot in Seoul, the capital of Korea. So Korea is also dangerously close to Japan. Around this time period, like I talked about in the last video, so I don't really need to go into too much detail, but Japan felt the need to expand to, sort of become respected by the other powers of the world so that, America or Europe won't step in and just colonize Japan. So they felt that if they wanted respect from those countries, they needed to build up their own empire, and Korea is right there. One Japanese official once said that Korea is like a dagger pointed at the heart of Japan. If anyone wants to destroy Japan, just take Korea, which, by the way, at this time, both China had domination over Korea, but Russia also had ambitions to take over Korea. Meanwhile, both the United States and the United Kingdom both had fought small skirmishes in Korea, and so there's this whole idea that Korea is going to be taken over by somebody. And the Japanese felt that if Korea is going to be taken over by anybody, it should be taken over by Japan, because Korea is a very critical point, because it's a dagger pointed at the heart of Japan. However, first things first, Japan wanted to normalize relations with Korea. So, in 1869, they send a letter to the Korean kingdom, and they say, hey, we should set up normal political relations. I'm a new country now, the Empire of Japan, and why don't we chill? Why don't we be friends? The thing is, they informed Korea that they now have an emperor, Emperor Meiji. Korea was part of the Qing Empire. In Qing China, there is a character, a Chinese character that means emperor. And it was illegal to use that character outside of the context of the Emperor of China. So when Japan, which used Chinese letters, or Chinese characters, kanji, sent its letter to Korea, when they said, hey, we have an emperor, they wrote emperor with the Chinese character for emperor. So for the Koreans, when they saw that, they pretty much took it as an insult. Japan said, hey, we have an emperor, and Korea's like, what did you just say to me? Did you just use the word emperor outside of the context of the Emperor of China? So immediately things were off to a bad start. There's some sort of historical debate over whether or not Korea was insulted that Japan used the term emperor when they swore fealty to the Chinese emperor, or whether they were insulted because they misunderstood the use of the word emperor to mean that Japan was trying to take over Korea and make Emperor Meiji Korea's emperor as well. Personally, I think it makes more sense for the theory that the Koreans were offended by the use of the term emperor outside the context of the Qing emperor, because that's frankly what makes more sense. Korea had been owned by the Qing dynasty for a long time now. So in 1869, because Japan used that kanji, Korea refused to, talk to Japan. Japan ultimately was like, okay, you're not talking to us, we're just going to make relations on our own. Instead of negotiating how trade is going to be conducted on Tsushima, we're just going to send trade officials there and just tell you forthright that you're now conducting trade with the Empire of Japan and you need to do so as a proper country. They essentially did to Korea what America did to Japan. Had to force it open to proper diplomatic relations. Let's see. Seikanon. So, already things aren't going so well with Japan, so the people who are pushing for an invasion of Korea start the Seikanon. And what you see here is a woodblock printing of the Seikanon, the debate that was held over a long period of time over whether or not to invade Korea. The man you see seated with the red robe and stuff, that would be Emperor Meiji. And of course you have his military officials and politicians all around him. So they're debating whether or not to invade Korea. The idea is to punish Korea. Saigo Takamori actually brings it up. Saigo Takamori, let me bring him up again. Saigo Takamori actually brings it up. He says, okay, as with a lot with history, there's something someone says and something how they actually feel. What Saigo says is that Korea refused to talk to us because they disrespected our emperor by refusing to recognize him as emperor. So, we need to punish them for, insulting the emperor. So we should launch an invasion. What Saigo's really thinking is, he's already becoming upset that the samurai class is losing rights in Japan. So he's of the position that the samurai are gone, but if we're going to get rid of the samurai class, we may as well let the samurai die with honor. And of course, in Bushido, there is no greater honor than dying on the battlefield. He doesn't even really want to conquer Korea. What he wants is a war with Korea to conquer Korea that will cause the samurai to die honorable deaths on the battlefield. So the samurai won't die by just becoming weak when the Empire has abolished the samurai system. Also, he wants to avoid the samurai starting a rebellion in Japan. So there are multiple levels as to why he wants to invade Korea. Ultimately, it's a lot of patriotic stuff. A lot of self-sacrificing patriotic stuff. He understands that he and his people are no longer needed in the country, so he wants to at least die than have have the potential of worse stuff to happen to the country if they continue to live. So it's a good place to send the samurai because they're about to rebel. It's a good place for samurai to die honorably as opposed to, just being wiped out through law. Saigo Takamori actually volunteers. He says, alright, I know how we'll start the war. I myself will go to Korea and I will just act like an idiot in Korea, just act like a monster until the Koreans kill me. And then you guys can use the fact that they killed one of Japan's national heroes as a pretext for invasion. Although he does actually believe that Japan will win the war. He believes Japan will win the war and take over the Korea, but that's not his priority. His priority is just to have samurai die honorably, which sounds horrible, but it really is sort of, in Japanese culture, a very self-sacrificing thing to do. He literally volunteered. His plan includes him being killed. Not many people make plans for themselves to die, but he plans on dying for the Emperor. Now, after the Iwakura mission, Emperor Meiji looks at the information for the Iwakura mission and realizes that Japan's economy is too weak to sustain an invasion of Korea, and the Japanese military, though more advanced than Korea, cannot take all of China at once, because war with Korea would mean war with China. And so Meiji ultimately says, it's just not feasible, guys. We can't just invade Korea. So the Seikanron ends, the debate's finished, Emperor Meiji declares, no, we will not take over Korea. Now Saigo Takamori, who saw the potential invasion of Korea as sort of the last chance for his people, he's just like, I quit. I'm out, man. I'm no longer going to go into this politics stuff. He resigns from all of his offices, I guess, in sort of protest of the decision, and he goes home to Kagoshima in the Satsuma domain. And I have a map of Kyushu right here. This island is the island of Kyushu. It's where Satsuma is based, sort of where you see Kagoshima is. And Kagoshima is the home of Saigo Takamori. So he resigns from politics and goes over to Kagoshima. A lot of Satsuma ex-samurai throughout the Japanese military and the police force, when Saigo quits and returns home to Kagoshima, they do the same too. So you have this weird thing of this whole clique of people just stopping and giving up, quitting, and going home. Veterans of the Boshin War. So they all go to Kagoshima following their sort of, figurehead, Takamori. In 1874, Takamori establishes his own little private academy in Kagoshima. And then more branches of the academy are made. They sort of spread throughout Kyushu. The academies are focused on training ex-samurai in things like weapons and military tactics. Essentially, he's setting up these little paramilitary camps. Which, as you can imagine, if you're a politician in Tokyo, and you're seeing that this dude who's angry at the government, and who is part of the ex-samurai class that sort of is unhappy, is making these paramilitary academies, you're gonna feel a bit nervous. Like, is he gonna use those military academies against us? But, let's see. The governor of Satsuma, because again, at this point, Satsuma is no longer a domain, so there's no daimyo of Satsuma. Now it's a governor of Satsuma because Satsuma is a prefecture. The governor of Satsuma is like, you know what? I like you, Saigo Takamori. Why don't we... I'm going to support you. He even appoints graduates of his academy to positions in political offices. So, Kagoshima and the Satsuma region, and even throughout Kyushu, you have pro-Saigo Takamori, pissed-off samurai, ex-samurai dudes, just sort of establishing their own political establishment, as it were. And by the time of 1876, there's so much support for Saigo in Kyushu, and especially in Satsuma, that Satsuma itself may as well have been seceded from the Japanese Empire. Satsuma was pretty much under its own rules at this point. Not legally, Satsuma never declared independence, but it effectively didn't really follow laws that were made by Tokyo. Although by 1876, Saigo had also retired, he was sort of just chilling with his academy. And I actually have a picture of his academy, of his peeps, somewhere. Takamori School. The dude seated in the chair with his beard, that's an old Saigo Takamori, because he's getting old by now. But around him are students of his academy. So as you can see, they're wearing traditional samurai armor. This is very much a samurai training school. So let's go back to Tokyo, because if you're part of the Meiji oligarchy, part of the government, you're going to be a little concerned, because Saigo Takamori is wielding all this, samurai support in Kyushu. And there also have been other rebellions at this point from samurai. In 1874, you had the Saga Rebellion in Kyushu. In 1876, you had the Shimpuren Rebellion in Kumamoto. In 1876, you had the Aizuki Rebellion in Kyushu. In 1876, you had the Hagi Rebellion in Yamaguchi and Choshu. So, rebellions after rebellions after rebellions is what the Japanese Empire has been dealing with all these samurai. Now, it has been very easy to put down these samurai rebellions. Typically, it's like one castle rebels, the Imperial Japanese Army gets sent down there, and then they just mow them down with Gatling guns. Because the samurai are, just like the Boshin War, the rebels are samurai, traditionalist samurai who are using traditional samurai tactics. The Imperial Japanese Army has muskets, Gatling guns, and Western strategy. But, as these rebellions are breaking out, in 1876, the Tokyo government, Emperor Meiji, decides that we need to send someone to, investigate the situation. So they send a police officer and 50 other... Why do I have it written down? Police officer, 57... They send a unit of police officers to Kagoshima to sort of investigate Saigo Takamori. To sort of investigate him for, subversive activities and sowing unrest. However, some Saigo loyalists capture the police officers and they torture them, and their leader confesses that they are spies who had been sent to assassinate Saigo. Now, there is academic debate over this. In Japan, there's a general consensus that yes, these police officers were assassins sent by Emperor Meiji to kill Takamori. However, it really does seem that their confession of being a spy is coerced, and the dude who confessed it, Nakahira Hisao, the head police officer, will later go on the record saying, yeah, they made me say it, but it's not true. Personally, I don't think the police officers had the intention to assassinate Takamori. Although, it's very hard to say. But from the Satsuma perspective, the Japanese government sent assassins to kill their leader, Saigo Takamori. This is the equivalent of if the American government sent assassins to kill Alexander Hamilton after the revolution. This is like 8 years after the Boshin War. So like 8 years after America wins independence, they tried to assassinate Alexander Hamilton. Now, Alexander Hamilton actually did get shot, but it wasn't like an act of assassination. Let's see. So now Satsuma's like, yo, Tokyo, Japanese government, you just tried to assassinate our leader. So Japan is freaking out and they're like, oh no, this is the last group of people we needed to have pissed off today. So they send a warship to Kagoshima, the home of Saigo Takamori. They send them there to take away Kagoshima's weapons, to confiscate the Kagoshima arsenal on January 30th, 1877. This sparks open conflict because 50 students from Saigo's academy attack the Imperial Japanese Navy forces, and they confiscate the weapons at the arsenal for themselves. So now we have Saigo Takamori's Samurai Academy armed with modern weaponry. Over the next 3 days, over 1,000 students stage raids and on naval yards and arsenals. So essentially, for 3 days, Saigo's students are going and collecting weapons from everywhere. Now, so essentially, rebellion's broken out. It's called the Satsuma Rebellion in English. In Japanese, it's called the Seinan Senso, which means the Southwestern War. I think Southwestern War is a better way to describe the conflict because rebellion makes it sound small. This was a fairly big war, especially coming right after the Boshin War. I might call it the Satsuma War for the remainder of this, lecture. So Saigo, who's an old man at this point and doesn't want to go to battle, everyone's like, you have to come, you have to fight because we're fighting this war for you. So Saigo's like, okay, and then he sort of reluctantly comes out of his retirement to lead this rebellion against the national government, against the Empire of Japan, the country he himself created. So, let's go to the Kyushu map. Bam! In February of 1877, Emperor Meiji sends a politician, along with Admiral Kawamura Sumiyoshi, on a warship called the Takao, to sort of go over to Kagoshima and sort of figure out what's going on in Kyushu, to sort of ascertain if whether or not this is a full-scale rebellion or not. Now, the admiral that's sent to check on Saigo is Kawamura Sumiyoshi. Here. What's important to know is Kawamura is Saigo's cousin. So the Imperial Japanese Navy officer who's going down to check up on Saigo is his own cousin. The governor of Satsuma walks up to the politician and Kawamura and says that this uprising is in the response of the assassination attempt. He asks for Kawamura to come ashore to calm the situation. He's sort of asking, like, okay, I'm the government of Satsuma, I don't like the imperial government, but hey, you're Saigo's cousin, maybe you can talk him down, maybe we can figure out a way to end this rebellion with a peaceful understanding. So, the governor leaves the Takao, the boat, after negotiating with them, but then, like, the moment he leaves, where is it? Bam! All of a sudden, Satsuma forces come up and raid the Takao. You have this clash going on. And you'll see a theme here. Typically on the left-hand side, you'll see people with, rising sun flags, and on the right-hand side, you'll see samurai. But here you have Satsuma forces engaging the Imperial Japanese Navy off the coast of Kagoshima. The governor departed, but a flotilla of small ships with armed men attempted to board the Takao by force, but they were repelled. Now, after this sudden surprise attack on the Takao, the politician who was sent was like, okay, Mr. Satsuma Governor, I can't let Kawamura just go over to Kyushu. I can't let him land on shore because this is crazy. You left and then we got attacked, so no thank you. On February 12th, the ship returned to Tokyo. The politician met with Imperial Japanese Army Officer General Yamagata Aritomo. If you remember, that is... this guy. A Choshu, former Choshu officer, now an officer of the Imperial Japanese Army. So the politician who was sent to Kagoshima meets up with General Yamagata Aritomo, and he also meets with Ito Hirobumi, who, if you remember, these guys were both once Saigo's friends, with Hirobumi being like one of his best friends. He meets with these two guys, and they come to the conclusion that they need to dispatch the Imperial Japanese Army to Kagoshima to prevent this revolt from spreading around to the rest of Satsuma and to the rest of Kyushu. and then by extension to the rest of Japan. Meanwhile, on that same day they meet, Saigo meets with his lieutenants, and he outlines his plan of what he wants to do. He says that he's going to get some troops, and he's going to march to Tokyo itself. He's going to march all the way up to Tokyo, and then just ask the government, ask the emperor, ask his former friends, what's going on? Why did you send people to assassinate me, Haas? So you have a lot of volunteers sign up. A lot of people want to join Saigo Takamori on this march. But Takamori says, despite this being a rebellion, I don't want this to get out of hand. I want to sound like I'm open to negotiation, because he is open to negotiation. He rejects volunteers who want to come, to burn Tokyo to the ground. He does not ask for help from other Satsuma loyalists and former samurai. And when he goes out and marches, he's dressed up in his Imperial Japanese Army uniform to sort of show a sign of loyalism to the Japanese government. He does not leave any troops behind at Kagoshima, though. All his troops are with him on the march. Kagoshima's just open to occupation. Now, as they march northward, they face a lot of snowfall. And I think I might have mentioned this, but I might not have during the Boshin War episode. When Saigo was marching north during the Boshin War against the Shogun forces, it was one of the most snowiest times in Japan. The worst snow they had gotten in years. When Saigo was marching from Kagoshima northward, he's facing again a lot of snow. The worst snow that region had seen in 50 years. Now, you would think marching through a blizzard would be seen as a bad sign, but for most of the Satsuma forces loyalists to Saigo, the rebels, they viewed this as a sign of divine support, because they said, hey, we had to march through snow during the Boshin War and we won. So maybe if we have to march through snow during the Satsuma Rebellion, the Satsuma War will win again. Of course, snow isn't, marching through a blizzard isn't necessarily a good, sound military strategy of how to win wars. So Saigo and his forces eventually come upon Kumamoto Castle. Although first I have a picture. Here's a drawing of Imperial Japanese Army soldiers getting ready to deploy from Tokyo to head over to Kyushu to fight in the Satsuma War. I just have a picture. So let's compare something here. Here are soldiers of the Imperial Japanese Army who were stationed at Kumamoto Castle, which we'll get to. And here's Takamori's students, the troops he's marching with. Now you might see a disparity between the two sides, because one of them is wearing samurai armor with swords. The other are wearing military uniforms based off the French and American Union armies at this time. And they use muskets. So there is a technological deficiency. One of these troops are not like the others. But yes. So Saigo marches northward. Let me show you Kyushu. He marches up to Kumamoto. You might see Kumamoto above Kyushu on the map. The word Kyushu. If you just look north, there's Kumamoto. So he's marching north up towards Tokyo. He goes to Kumamoto, and he comes across Kumamoto Castle. It's sort of an impasse, something he needs to pass in order to get to Tokyo. Now, the image in the background for today's episode is Kumamoto Castle. It was one of the strongest castles in all of Japan at the time. So, on February 14th, is when the Satsuma forces approach Kumamoto Castle. Kumamoto Castle is held by forces who are mostly from Kagoshima. So the general in charge of the Imperial Japanese Army at Kumamoto Castle is kind of concerned, saying okay, there's a 98% chance my troops are going to betray me and move to the other side. I'm not going to go on the offensive. I'm going to stay on the defensive. So they fortify the castle, which previously in the there was a rebellion that I mentioned earlier that Kumamoto Castle was involved in, and their storehouse burned down during the rebellion, which got rid of all of their food and ammunition. So they're trying to defend this castle without any fresh food or any storehouses of ammunition. So good luck to that. But yeah, the IJA start fortifying the castle. Eventually, on February 19th, Takamori gives the order to storm the castle. They're sort of trying to force their way in. And then the IJA opens fire to defend the castle. And you have your siege of Kumamoto Castle. The battle doesn't really go anywhere. It's definitely a battle of attrition. By February 24th, the Satsuma forces had to entrench themselves around the castle in a hopes, it's a siege. They're trying to starve them out. And of course, it's freezing, so sucks to be in the trenches. But they wait for a while. But eventually, they get Imperial reinforcements from Tokyo that I showed you earlier. And Saigo is forced to retreat from Kumamoto. Meanwhile, on March 9th, Emperor Meiji strips Saigo of his titles and offices and his ranks. So the Emperor sort of declares Saigo a rebel at this point. And yeah, the Satsuma forces begin to retreat. It doesn't take them long for them to meet with the Imperial Japanese Army again in the Battle of Tambaruzaka. Now, Tambaruzaka is very close to Kumamoto. They didn't get far with their retreat. And there are a few images of the Battle of Tambaruzaka. This is the best one. Again, you'll notice samurai on the right-hand side, Imperial Japanese Army on the left-hand side with the rising sun flag. But on March 4th, the Imperial Japanese Army, this is under Yamagata. Boom. So he's finally arrived at the front lines against his former friend Saigo Takamori. Yamagata's forces attack the retreating Saigo Takamori forces near Kumamoto. It's an 8-day-long battle, and it's just a bloodbath. During the battle, Saigo writes a letter to Prince Arisugawa, who's a member of the imperial family. He restates his reasons for going to Tokyo, or at least trying to march to Tokyo, saying that he's just trying to ask questions, and that he says that he's not committing to a rebellion, and he's looking for a peaceful settlement. But the Tokyo government refuses to negotiate with Takamori even after receiving the letter. The Imperial Japanese Army, I should note that the Imperial Japanese Army that's being deployed to the Satsuma War are mostly troops from Tokyo and police forces. Well-armed police forces are taking part in this war. So while this battle's going on, Imperial Japanese forces attack Kagoshima, sort of behind Takamori, his hometown. So by March 8th, the Kagoshima is seized by the Imperial Japanese Army. The governor of Satsuma is taken into custody. Yamagata continues to land forces behind rebel lines and take more of the Satsuma province. And then they begin to strike the rear of Satsuma's army. So, essentially, Saigo Takamori and his forces are getting hit from both the north and the south. Troops coming in from Kumamoto and troops coming in from Kagoshima. Eventually, the Satsuma forces retreat, but they have heavy casualties. The Battle of Tambaruzaka was a huge battle. It wiped out a lot of Satsuma forces here. So now, they're continuing their retreat from Kumamoto. Saigo led his followers on a 7-day march to Hitoyoshi. Although his morale was low, his troops pretty much didn't want to be there, They had to dug into these really cold trenches, had to wait for the next Imperial Japanese Army offensive. However, the Imperial Japanese Army had also lost a lot of troops during the war as well, and so the fighting sort of paused for a few weeks while both sides were getting reinforcements. Let's see. Eventually, the Imperial Japanese Army goes on the offensive once more, once they're all, loaded up, locked and loaded, and they just continue to push Saigo back. They push him from Miyazaki. Part of his retreating tactic, Saigo actually left behind some samurai, like pockets of samurai to do guerrilla warfare against the advancing Imperial Japanese army, but they really didn't make a difference. By July 4th, Saigo was pushed out of Miyako no Jo in Nobeoka. These places aren't really important to know. They don't show up on the map. What you really need to know about the map is Kumamoto and Kagoshima. That's the two main places. More troops are landed from Tokyo. It's just, a bloodbath. Saigo gets caught in a pincer attack. The Satsuma forces get into an encirclement, but by August 17th, the Satsuma army is reduced to 2,000. It has lost most of its modern firearms and every single piece of artillery it owns, so now they're really only using swords, but they barely managed to get out of an encirclement and continue to flee to to Kagoshima. Of course, Kagoshima is controlled by the Imperial Japanese army, so what they do is they go to Mount Enodake. Well, they go to Mount Enodake. They're like, it's over, Anakin. I have the high ground. But they get surrounded. So you have this point where they're just defending this mountain. They're surrounded. It's just a bloodbath. Yamagata sends in a large Imperial Japanese army force that outnumbers the Satsuma forces 7-1. Eventually, most of the rebels surrender or they commit seppuku. They stab themselves with a sword. Saigo, however, he escapes. He burns his private papers. He burns his army uniform. He's like, okay, by this point, I was going to make a meme at some point. Punished snake, a fallen hero or whatever it is, who's disowned by his homeland. But I didn't have enough time to make up a punished Saigo meme. If anyone has the time to make a punished Saigo meme, assuming I don't eventually do it, I would love to see that. But Saigo's like, you've killed my people, you refuse to negotiate, you send assassins after me, you're trying to wipe out the samurai class, you refuse to listen to me with the invasion of Korea. You know what? Screw this country. I wish I never made the Empire of Japan. So he burns his uniform, burns his private papers, and he slips away from the Battle of Enodake. So he flees away to Kagoshima with his remaining able-bodied men, and they reach Kagoshima finally on September 1st, and they take Shiroyama, which sort of overlooks Kagoshima, which leads to the bloody Battle of Shiroyama. So there is a small rebel force on the top of this mountain. Yamagata Aritomo comes in with his IJA forces. They surround the mountain, but Yamagata doesn't want to leave anything to chance. Saigo Takamori, after all, is the hero of the empire. He's the dude who crushed the shogun. So what he does is he doesn't leave anything to chance. He spends several days constructing systems of ditches, trenches, walls, some obstacles to prevent Saigo's forces from breaking out of the encirclement, like at Enodake and at the other place, I forget where. I deleted it from my notes. He takes the 5 warships that were stationed in Kagoshima and uses them to besiege the mountain. So ultimately, Saigo's screwed. The Imperial Japanese army outnumbers Saigo Takamori's Satsuma forces 60-1. 60-1. That is abysmal odds. 60-1. While he's just sitting up there on the mountain being sieged, Saigo writes a letter. Yamagata writes a letter to Saigo and asks him to surrender, but Saigo rejects the letter. Saigo is pretty much determined to fight to the death at this point because he's pissed. And so on September 24th, Yamagata orders a full frontal assault on Shiroyama. Within the first few, maybe the first hour, at 6 o'clock a.m., Saigo's forces are almost wiped completely off the map. There are only a total of 40 rebels still alive. Just within the first, bam, just took your forces from 2,000 to 40 real freaking quick. So 40 rebels are left alive, Saigo Takamori gets fatally wounded. And ultimately, Saigo Takamori commits seppuku. He commits suicide by the sword. Now, there is academic debates on whether or not he killed himself with the sword, or if he died of his bullet wounds, and then to sort of preserve his honor, his kaishakunin, that's the dude who cuts off your head while you're doing seppuku, just chopped off the head of his dead body to make it seem like he committed seppuku, to sort of preserve his honor. It's debated. The large consensus is that he committed seppuku. We'll never know if he did or not, so there's no harm in saying he committed seppuku, died honorably. So, with their leader dead, what do the last 39 rebels do? Well, they draw their swords, and they just run down the mountain. And almost immediately, they get killed, wiped out. And with the last Satsuma rebel dead, the Satsuma Rebellion, the Southwest War, the Satsuma War, comes to an end. Completely wiped out. So, what happened because of all this? Well, the Satsuma Rebellion drastically strained the Japanese economy. It drained the Japanese economy so badly that the Japanese Empire had to leave the gold standard, and then they began making paper currency. You see your first yen bills being produced at this time. Also, because of this rebellion, the last of the samurai class ends. There is no more samurai class. If all that's left are descendants of samurai, who pretty much are hardline people, but they don't have any privileges anymore. The samurai, at this point, with their last death of the last rebel on Shiroyama, 1877, was the end of the samurai. The people of Japan, despite Saigo Takamori being a rebel, everyone in the Japanese Empire revered Saigo Takamori as a hero. They remembered Saigo Takamori as the hero of the Empire from the Boshin War, and so this war was very unpopular with the Japanese people. They just saw their empire, their government that was starting to get corrupt anyway, turning against its national hero. So people were pissed off at the government, people revered Saigo as a hero, and ultimately there were calls for reform. To reform the Japanese Empire. So, immediately after the Satsuma Rebellion, you have this period of about 10 or so years of reform. And I have, in chronological order, the list of the major reforms. First, in 1876, was when the Sword Abolishment Act took place. People's weapons were taken away. Japan had faced so many rebellions, especially the last one, that it was just like, I ain't dealing with rebellions anymore. So in 1876, weapons, firearms, swords, muskets, what have you, were confiscated. This is the origin of Japan's gun policies. Like, if you know, Japan, you're not allowed to own a gun in Japan, with like some exceptions. This originates because of the Satsuma Rebellion. In 1884, you had the Chichibu incident in Saitama, pretty much right beside Tokyo. Some peasants are tired of the Meiji oligarchy pretty much having all the power. The people don't feel represented. So in 1884, some peasants rise up. Eventually, the IJA gets sent in and they put down the peasants violently. But still, it's a sign that the people are unhappy with the Meiji oligarchy now. They might have been fine heroes for the Boshin War and setting up the Japanese government, but, you know, it's gone out of control now. So finally, Emperor Meiji sees what's going on and he's like, okay, we need to do some changes. And in 1889, he writes the Meiji Constitution. And with the Meiji Constitution, he pretty much gives up his absolute monarch power status. It's a very complicated... Basically, the Meiji Constitution opened up elections in Japan. It did turn Japan into a democracy. A lot of people don't know this. The Empire of Japan was a democracy. Not necessarily a liberal democracy, but it was a democracy. It did have positions filled out by people who were voted in by the general populace. So, with the Meiji Constitution, what is called the Diet of Japan, which is their Congress, was created with elected officials. The Prime Minister office was established. The office of the Prime Minister was established. Ito Hirobumi, if you remember him from earlier, he gets declared as the first Prime Minister of Japan. So we have a democracy, we have a prime minister. What does the emperor do? The emperor pretty much is allowed to sit back and just continue to be a spiritual figurehead. However, if the emperor wants to step in and do something, he can. So it's sort of a constitutional monarchy where it's a democracy, except if the emperor wants to do something, he doesn't have any checks and balances against him. That's really what it is. But the emperor is sort of trusted to stay out of political affairs. It's the realm of the prime minister. It's the realm of the elected officials. With the Meiji Constitution, Japan becomes a democracy. And that later on in that same year, Emperor Meiji himself posthumously pardons Saigo Takamori. He pardons Takamori for his rebellion, and once more, Saigo Takamori is considered a hero in Japan. So, that is the story of the Satsuma Rebellion, the Satsuma War, Japan's last great civil war. Hopefully, next time we meet, I'll have enough stuff for the Middle Eastern history course, but yeah. So, yeah, Japan's established as a democracy now. I didn't mean to accidentally sort of make a two-parter on... This could very well turn into a course on Japanese history, but I don't want it to be. I already wrote an ebook on Japanese history from this time period onwards. And I really want to get to the Middle East, because that's very important when understanding the context of modern politics, modern foreign policy in particular. So, thank you guys so much for coming out. Hopefully I'll see you next Thursday. If I don't, I'll see you at some Thursday. I don't know when. But, yeah, thank you guys for coming out. Hopefully when we next meet, I'll have some information about the Middle East to begin that, course. And have a good day, ladies and gentlemen.